Hi, and welcome to Basic Food Theory and Product Knowledge. This is Lesson 3, Part 1. Next week we'll be looking at Lesson 3, Part 2. This week's class we are going to be taking a look at the plant. According to Health Canada, the new Canada's Food Guide to Healthy Eating, the recommendation is that the majority of food should be plant-based. And if we take a look at a plant, well, I'll break it down into the different parts of the plant and describe some of the vegetables that come from the different parts of the plant, as well as some of the nutritional information or some concepts with regards to cooking method, etc., to get the most out of these different parts of the plant. We take a look at the top of the plant. We have growing tip. Think about nice tender leaves. Herbs, for example, are a good example of something called a growing tip. If we look at some examples of herbs, you see things like mint, sweet basil, chervil, which is a licoricey flavored herb, very delicate. Looks a lot like parsley, but it's got a very delicate licorice taste to it. And of course parsley. These are all examples of the growing tip. So you can imagine they're very tender, very flavorful in some cases. Let's talk about culinary herbs. We talk about using herbs in food quite a lot, so I think we better talk a little bit about what an herb is. An herb is the green, tender, leafy part of the plant. So when we talk about using the herbs, this is what we're talking. Often it is the tips, or it could be the leaf of a plant. The herb is used in a dish. It enhances the flavor, maybe adds some flavor to the dish in the terms of, we talked about chervil having a bit of a licorice flavor, etc. Basil is a good example of an herb that adds some nice flavor to the dish. Also, these herbs add presentation. They'll add some generally green color to the dish. They can add some shape, etc. on the plate. Usually fresh herbs are added at the end of the cooking process. We want to do that to retain their bright, vibrant colors. We'll talk a little bit later in the lesson about colors of things, but generally speaking, green things, when you cook them too long, they lose their color. We want to include the herbs so they look fresh. The flavors jump with nice, fresh flavors. If you add the herbs too soon, the herbs turn brown. We lose some of that vibrant taste. Dried herbs are available. Remember that dried herbs, they've had the moisture removed, so it concentrates the flavor in the dried herbs. Dried herbs are generally about twice as flavorful as fresh. So if a recipe calls for so much fresh herb, then you use about half as much of the dried herb in order to get about the same taste. Usually the dried herbs are added in the dish before the end of cooking. This is done for a couple of reasons. One is that these herbs might contain pathogens or things that make you sick, bacteria, etc. And so we put the herbs in a little bit earlier in order to destroy any of these pathogens. Also, cooking the herbs in before the end of cooking, it helps to rehydrate the herbs so that they're softer and they're more like what they were when they were fresh. Now, you'll never get the same vibrant green color with a dried herb as you do with a fresh, but dried herbs can give you a really nice boost of taste or flavor. Remember that dried herbs have a shelf life of about 6 months. So if you're using dried herbs that are older than 6 months, use a little bit more than you would otherwise, because they've lost some of those acids, some of those volatiles that give you the really nice tastes. So dried herbs, they last only about 6 months. Often cooks will talk about herbs and spices. So seeing as we've described herbs, let's talk a little bit about spices. Remember that herbs are the tender, leafy parts of the plant. Spices are the harder parts of the plant, and the plants for spices are subtropical or tropical plants. We're using the harder parts like seeds in the case of, say, pepper, the bark in the case of cinnamon, or the roots of plants. The spices are used to add or enhance the flavor of a dish. In the case of some spices, you may add some color. For example, paprika would add a nice color to a dish. Generally speaking, spices are used to enhance flavors. Sometimes spices are used to add heat. So that's a spiciness. Remember, heat isn't one of the 5 tastes that you can identify. So in addition to the tastes and flavor that you get from spices, some will include heat if you're adding, for example, some chilies to a dish. Most spices are added at the beginning of the cooking process in order to blend the flavors properly and ensure that the flavors are mixed evenly throughout the dish. Many spices, particularly whole seeds, if you're talking about, say, whole cumin, for example, they benefit very much from toasting the seeds before you use them. Just in a warm pan. Don't make the pan get too hot. Just warm up these seeds, and then you can put them through a mortar and pestle, for example, to grind them up, or put them in a spice grinder, or include them in the dish whole. What warming the seeds up does is it activates these volatile oils, and then your spices are going to be much more enhanced, much more flavorful, and a nicer aroma off the spices as well. So we're looking further down on the plant. We have what are called swollen leaf buds. Now, really the only example I can think of a vegetable that is part of is a swollen leaf bud. Perhaps you can think of more, but Brussels sprout is a good example. Here we can see a picture of Brussels sprouts as they're growing along the stem of the plant. Brussels sprouts can be purchased fresh or frozen. They've become very popular. I've noticed them on a lot of menus lately, both as a vegetable accompaniment that have been either cooked or prepared in some way, such as boiled or steamed Brussels sprouts. That's very sort of typical. They lend themselves really well to butter, to onions, bacon. Well, what doesn't lend itself to bacon? But Brussels sprouts are very commonly and popularly boiled or steamed. I've seen roasted Brussels sprouts on many menus now. They add sort of a rich, almost a sweet taste. You can see charring the Brussels sprouts adds a different flavor to the Brussels sprouts, as well as pickled Brussels sprouts. I was just at a restaurant the other day where we were served pickled Brussels sprouts as part of an appetizer. Excellent, very delicious. As well as slaws. A variety of different leafy vegetables are being used to create slaws, not just cabbage anymore, but I'm seeing Brussels sprouts being used as a slaw in a variety of different menus now. So they're very, very versatile, and surprisingly they've become very popular. They are my favorite vegetable, but I understand they're not everybody's favorite vegetable. We take a look at seed pods on a plant. Seed pods, as I mentioned last week, we were talking about different nutrients, etc., and what the sources are. Seed pods, as you can imagine, these are the legumes. These are excellent sources of a lot of different nutrients. Peas are an example of the seed pod. Snow peas, string beans. Lentils are an example. They're a little bit different in that the pods contain only as few as 1 or as many as 3 seeds, unlike as you've seen with the beans and the peas, but they are definitely a legume. As well, peanuts. Now be careful with peanuts. Peanuts are a little bit different. Peanuts grow underground. You can see them attached to the root there, and I'm sure most of you have seen a peanut in a shell. It's exactly as other legumes are described. Legumes are typically low in fat, but what fat they do contain is a good fat, usually a monounsaturated fat. So we know from last week what the effects of monounsaturated fats are. So legumes are a good source of that. They're high in a number of different nutrients: folate, potassium, iron, magnesium. So that's the good source of that. If pregnant women, for example, require folate at higher levels, generally speaking, women require iron in higher levels. So legumes would be a good source of these nutrients. They're also a very good source of the soluble and insoluble fiber. We talked about dietary fiber last week. Legumes are a good source of these types of fibers. They're a good source of protein and can be a healthy substitute for meat. You can buy these legumes buy them fresh, we can buy them frozen, we can buy them dried, we can buy them canned. They come in a variety of different ways. For culinary applications, beans or legumes can be used as a vegetable accompaniment, as a side dish on the menu. Make beautiful soups out of legumes, particularly if you look at pureed pea soup, potage Saint-Germain, a sweet pea soup with a little bit of Pernod licorice flavoring in there. Is very, very delicate and delicious. Can be used as an ingredient in things like chili, for example. As I said, as a meat substitute, you see a lot of vegan burgers, for example, that are patties made up from legumes, beans, etc. And they can be used as salad ingredients. A good example, and I believe you'll be making this salad next semester, is the very famous French niçoise salad that has beans as one of the main components of that salad. If we move to the other side of the plant there, we can see this closed flower. Some examples of vegetables that are this part of the plant, a closed flower, are broccoli, for example. If you take a look at the top of the broccoli, all those little buds, these are all little flower buds. If you allow the broccoli to continue growing, that head will start to turn into open flowers, have all these beautiful open flowers in there. And then there are variations or versions of broccoli, Chinese broccoli. You can see some of the closed flowers have actually opened on the Chinese broccoli. And then a hybrid that's a blend or a combination of broccoli and Chinese broccoli, broccolini. You can see a really good example of the closed flower bud or buds at the top of the stem there. And rapini, which looks a lot like broccolini, but it's actually quite different. It's very peppery, and you can see the flower buds on the rapini. Cauliflower is another example. You can see the closed flowers all in the white flower head there. Many of these plants that we've just talked about, these are members of the Brassica family of plants. And you can see that plate of lovely rapini at the bottom there of the screen. Not only can we eat the flower, the closed flower part of the plant, but we can also eat the leaves and the stems, and they're quite delicious. They all have a very kind of pungent, sharp taste to them. And the reason for that is they're all part of the mustard family of plants. These are a very important culinary plant family. Sometimes these plants are referred to as crucifers. And the crucifer plants, or the Brassica family of plants, they contain sulfur compounds, which gives them their very distinctive, strong smell when they're cooking. You know, if you've ever come into the house when someone's cooked cabbage, for example, you can smell it very much. This is from the sulfur compound that's part of these plants. These sulfur compounds are very nutritionally beneficial, though they're powerful antioxidants, and we find them in the Brassica family of plants. As I said, not only are the buds edible, but the leaves and stems of many of the crucifers are consumed as a vegetable or as salad greens, in the case of, for example, arugula. But even with broccoli, which typically we're using just the flower buds, you can certainly, and they're very nice to use, the stems. Take some of the heavy fibers off the outside and you've got a nice succulent core that's good to eat raw, but it's also nice to include in stir fries or mixed vegetables, etc. When you're buying these closed flower vegetables, the broccoli, the cauliflower, etc., usually you're buying these fresh. You can buy frozen versions, particularly I'm thinking broccoli I've seen coming in frozen. And they can be used, as I said, for a variety of culinary applications. They're often served hot as a vegetable to accompany a dish. Cooking methods for these types, or this part of the plant for the closed flowers, usually very fast moist heat methods like boiling or steaming, or very fast dry heat methods like grilling or sautéing. These these parts of the plants, they tend to cook very quickly, don't require long cooking processes. We don't need to tenderize these parts of the plant, so very fast methods, either moist or dry heat methods, are often used for these dishes. The broccoli and cauliflower, sometimes they're served raw as part of a crudité platter. You can see in the bottom left of the screen there what a crudité platter is. That's a raw vegetable and dip tray. Very common, very popular in a lot of restaurants, a lot of kitchens. You can also see the steamed broccoli in the middle and the grilled cauliflower. Cauliflower has just become kind of explosive in terms of being popular on menus these days. A variety of different preparations as a replacement for carbohydrates in the form of making pizza crust from cauliflower, as a vegan alternative to a meat protein, having cauliflower steaks on a menu. We're seeing cauliflower being utilized quite frequently as a replacement for rice on dishes, for example. I've seen it used as a replacement for meat in taco fillings. Very, very versatile. The flower buds are referred to as florets, so your chef may ask you to get some broccoli or cauliflower florets. They're talking about just the top portion of the closed flower bud. And we have the open flowers found on many plants. In culinary applications, we do use a number of flowers. In fact, here are some examples of some of the culinary flowers that we might use. Snapdragon. My wife had some beautiful snapdragons growing in the garden one year, and she went down to admire them, and many of them weren't there anymore. She said, "What happened to my snapdragons?" I ate them. They've got a lovely, kind of a sweet but peppery taste to them. They're very delicious. Cornflower, beautiful blue color to put onto a plate. Geranium. Roses are nice. Roses and rose water is used a lot in baking, in dessert applications, but rose petals can be added to salads to add a really nice floral taste. Nasturtiums add a nice peppery taste to a dish. The leaves and the flowers of the nasturtium can be used, and you can see beautiful color from the nasturtiums. Sweet William, marigolds, orchids, and viola, pansies, and violets are used frequently in cooking. The edible flowers are most often purchased fresh, occasionally purchased candied, especially candied violets for garnishing desserts, etc. Make sure that the flowers that you're using are grown specifically for food. Don't use flowers from the florist. Don't go buy bunches of flowers from the florist or for the guy on the street corner selling the mums, etc. Many of these may have been treated with chemicals, so ensure that you're buying and using flowers strictly for culinary purposes that have been grown and processed specifically for food. Most often edible flowers are used raw. I am really hard pressed to imagine or think of a time where I've seen them cooked. They are used to add beautiful color, interesting shapes on the plate. Some of them will add a peppery or floral flavor to a dish. Certainly can enhance dishes with edible flowers. As I said, some flowers, particularly the violets, candied to use as a garnish on desserts. Here's what a candied violet looks like. The flower is brushed or dipped in egg white, and then sugar is added, and then it's allowed to crystallize and get nice and hard. Very beautiful and delicious. Here we can see some edible flowers incorporated into a salad, giving some beautiful color, some beautiful shape, texture, as well as adding some flavor to that variety of lettuces that are on the salad. And here we can see some edible flowers used as a garnish on a crab dish. Very elegant, adding some lovely color, very attractive. This hopefully isn't going to get too confusing, but let's talk about the fruit of the plant. Now, the fruit of the plant is often what we call a vegetable from a culinary perspective. Botanically, these are the fruit, and I'm going to talk about what distinguishes fruit from other parts of the plant. But let's take a look at fruit. Some examples of fruit that you might find on a plant would be strawberries, raspberries, currants, blueberries. So we're using the word berry quite a lot. Let's talk about what a berry is. The difference between berry and a fruit is all berries are fruit. But what makes a berry is that a berry has seed or seeds that are surrounded by a nutritious pulp. If you think about a tomato, when you think about a grape or a blueberry, the seed is on the inside, surrounded by this very nutritious, flavorful pulp. And that's what makes that type of fruit a berry. So both bananas and strawberries are fruit, but bananas are also berries. Strawberries are not. If you take a look at strawberries, the seeds are on the outside, which means they're not technically a berry. And here's where some confusion comes in, because, obviously if I say fruit, you're going to list things like strawberries, raspberries, currants, blueberries, but will you start listing things like tomatoes? Tomatoes are technically the fruit of a plant. Now, a very wise man said that knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. And philosophy is wondering if ketchup is a smoothie. So tomatoes are the fruit of a plant, and tomatoes come in a variety of different colors, different shapes, and are used in a variety of different culinary applications. Peppers are a fruit as well, so they contain the seeds of the plant. And peppers, there's a variety of different peppers as well, from the sweet bell peppers all the way up to the very spicy peppers. The spiciness of the peppers is measured using a scale called the Scoville scale. And this helps you to kind of look at the relative heat found in these peppers. Here's the Scoville scale. So if you look at the bottom, a bell pepper is 0. You can eat a bell pepper. It's not going to be hot. It's not going to be spicy. You don't need gloves when you're processing them. But if you work your way up, you can see jalapenos are 2,500 to 8,000 on the Scoville scale, which isn't particularly hot. When you get up to Scotch bonnets, for example, which are used in jerk chicken, jerk pork, they're 100,000 to 350,000. So quite a lot hotter than the jalapeno peppers. And if you take a look up at the top end, ghost peppers, which some of you may or may not have heard of, be familiar with, they're 855,000 to over 1 million on the Scoville scale. And if you go up even higher, the Carolina Reaper, which I've noticed has become quite popular for people to make those kind of suicidally hot sauces to go into chilies and for chicken wings and so on. The Carolina Reaper is about 1.5 million to over 2 million on the Scoville scale. So you can imagine very, very hot peppers. So that's the scale that's used to measure the relative spiciness of peppers. Other fruit that you would find on plants: cucumbers, zucchini. And here, if you notice, the zucchini, not only do we have the fruit, but we also have flowers growing. When you get the zucchini when they're very young, those flowers are beautiful, very edible. You can stuff them and use them on dishes. As a garnish, you can put a nice arrangement of small cut vegetables. If you do a brunoise, a mixed brunoise called confetti, which is a mixture of vegetables cut into a brunoise, you can stuff these flowers with these vegetables, and they make a really interesting and nice accompaniment on dishes. As well, squash is a fruit, different squash, and pumpkin. These are all examples of fruit that are in or on plants. Many culinary applications. It's such a broad subject. Oftentimes the sweet fruit are relegated or used frequently for desserts, but they can also lend themselves very well to savory dishes. Sweet fruit used in desserts are often served whole, the berries, for example, as a garnish on desserts, or they can be processed into sauces. A pureed fruit sauce is what's called a coulis. And I hope your chef instructor will demonstrate coolly for you. Sweet fruit also do lend themselves to savory if you think about dishes like applesauce served with pork or cranberry jelly with turkey. I always put blueberries when I'm making up game stew. The blueberries go beautifully with venison and so on. Sweet fruit go beautifully with poultry items, with duck. Plums and so on go beautifully with duck. Orange, very traditional accompaniment. So sweet doesn't necessarily mean that it's relegated only to desserts. It can also be used as an accompaniment or a flavor builder with savory dishes. Many of the vegetables that we serve as sides are botanically fruit, but as that wise man said, just because they're fruit, don't put them in a fruit salad. Oftentimes the fruit of plants used as salad ingredients, either the sweet fruit in a fruit salad, or using the fruit, like a tomato salad, for example, is a beautiful salad, a cucumber salad. So these fruit can be used as salad ingredients or components in salads. The variety of colors and flavors and textures and shapes make the fruit of plants very, very versatile. The plant stores a lot of its nutrients in the fruit, and that makes the fruit that we eat, whether it be as a fruit or vegetable, really good sources of a lot of the different nutrients that we need, from cellulose or dietary fiber, vitamins, minerals, etc. Most fruit or vegetables are a very good source of these nutrients. The leaf of the plant. This is not just the tips. This is the broader leaves, the bigger leaves, the more mature leaves, perhaps, of plants. Some of the leaves that we eat, especially on smaller plants, these are, again, herbs. We're not just eating the tips, but some of these plants have very woody stems that are really not edible, although we can use the stems for flavor builders if we're making up, say, a bouquet garni, or using the stems as, say, a smoking agent. If we're going to smoke something, we can use the woody stems from things like thyme for that purpose. But the tender leaves from the thyme are used as a culinary herb. Rosemary, similarly, very kind of a piney taste, goes really well with strong flavored meats, for example, lamb. Tarragon has got a more strong licorice taste than the chervil, not quite as subtle, but this is typically used in a variety of different applications, but it also flavors a sauce like a hollandaise called a béarnaise sauce, which we use with meats. As well, there are herbs that we use, or sorry, leaves that we use as vegetables, a variety of different lettuces. These are the leaves of the plant. And when you talk about lettuce, I know oftentimes there's iceberg and perhaps Boston lettuce, and really that's about it. Or, of course, romaine lettuce for Caesar salad. Excuse me, but there's a large variety of lettuces that we can use. Here we can see a few of them. Each of them have their own distinct shape, color, texture, from very crisp and succulent like a romaine lettuce to very soft and buttery like a Bibb lettuce or like a mâche. A huge variety that we can incorporate into our salads as part of the salad green mix. Some of them are very bitter, like the radicchio or the Belgian endive. Have some bitterness to them, and then we can use that and blend it with some nice mild sweet lettuces like mâche and Bibb lettuce. Add some pepperiness with the arugula. We can blend and combine all these leaves to make salads that are delicious and don't require a lot of dressing. If you're talking about nutritional cooking, if we can get a lot of flavor out of our salads, for example, then we can use less vinaigrette, which means we're exposing our customers to less oil, for example, if we're looking at caloric intake. So think about a variety of different lettuces and greens in salad preparation. Cabbages, they're part of the Brassica family as well, but there's a variety of different cabbages, again with very distinct characteristics, very distinct color, and different nutritional values. For example, you look at anything that's red or purple, it's a good indicator that it's a good high antioxidant source. So, for example, the red cabbage containing a pigment called anthocyanin, which helps to, it's a powerful antioxidant. All of the cabbages are good sources of dietary fiber, cellulose, and have different applications, and they have different textures, from sort of leathery leaves to very crisp leaves. So you can see some different ones. Kale is an example of another type of leaf that would be used. Swiss chard looks a lot like rhubarb. Don't confuse the two. In this case, the leaves can be eaten, rhubarb not. But the leaves and the stem of the chard are delicious. And bok choy. So there's some examples of the leaves of plants. Oh, spinach. Who can forget spinach? Very nutritious, very versatile as a raw salad ingredient, as a cooked vegetable, used as stuffing in a variety of different applications, in pastas, in meats, chicken breast, for example. Very, very versatile and very nutritious. Collards, we see collards, particularly southern U.S. cooking, Caribbean cooking, cooking collards. So you may come across those. These are all good, highly nutritious types of, or parts of the plant. As we saw, the leaves come in a variety of different shapes, colors, and textures. The ones that are more delicate, generally they're served raw. Generally, lettuces, for example, you consider them to be served raw, although some can be beautifully grilled or braised. So you may use some cooking technique for some of these lettuces, but again, often they lend themselves to be served raw. Some of the hardier leaves can be used either on their own, for example, a braised cabbage, either a braised red cabbage or white cabbage or green cabbage, or cabbage is used, or leaves used as a component in a dish, like cabbage rolls. Many of the leaves, particularly the deep green ones, are a good source of many nutrients such as vitamins, minerals, dietary fiber, and others. Example, the red cabbage, a good source of powerful antioxidants. Example, anthocyanin. So one sort of diet that I've heard about, people call it, I think they call it the confetti diet as well, I think. But it's based on having tons of colors on the plate. And I think that's true. If you have a variety of different colors, it stands to reason you're getting a lot of different nutrients. And particularly when you're looking at, the red and purple, and in some cases the orange yellow vegetables, you're getting a really good source of antioxidants. Just be careful. Some of the leaves from otherwise edible plants can be toxic to humans. Example, the rhubarb leaves can be toxic. Tomato leaves, potato leaves can be toxic. So just because the root or the tuber or the fruit or the stem is edible, the leaves shouldn't be consumed. It can be toxic. Speaking of stems, let's take a look at the stem of the plant. So some examples of vegetables that come from the stem of the plant. Celery is a good example. Asparagus is an example. And I've mentioned rhubarb is another example. Now you notice the rhubarb looks a lot like Swiss chard, but remember that the Swiss chard, you can eat the leaves. Rhubarb, you cannot eat the leaves of rhubarb. The stems from many plants have a lot of different culinary applications. The stems are generally a good source of cellulose. The less you can process the stems, peeling the fiber off, the higher the cellulose is going to be on the plate. But as the plant gets bigger, that fiber around the outside of the stem becomes inedible, even though some of this dietary fiber isn't going to break down. It's insoluble fiber. Some of it's even too thick. So if you're eating, say, a broccoli stem, that fiber is just going to be like a wad in your mouth, and so in that case, that should be peeled. But if you're talking about, asparagus, for example, We used to always have to peel our asparagus in order to make it more visually appealing for our customers. Um, but we're removing some of the good nutrient from the asparagus. So these days it's not uncommon not to peel things like asparagus. Um, Here we can see some applications for celery. Celery can be used beautifully as a hot vegetable. Braised celery is a pretty classic preparation. These days we're using celery a lot as flavor builders as part of what's called a mirepoix. Here we can see raw celery being used as an hors d'oeuvre, part of the crudité platter. Celery is very commonly used there. Or here we see some nice asparagus. You can see that it hasn't been peeled, so you're retaining that dietary fiber. And of course, who doesn't like rhubarb pie? We move down the plant, just above the soil, or right at soil level, we have something that's called the swollen store base. Vegetables such as the navet, or the white turnip, or the yellow turnip, the rutabaga, these are examples of vegetables that are part of this base. Beets are found here. Kohlrabi, which is a hybridized vegetable. It's a hybrid of turnip and cabbage, but the swollen base is the part of the kohlrabi that we eat. These vegetables, often we refer to them as root vegetables, although technically they're not. It's not uncommon to hear them called root vegetables. They share a lot of the same characteristics as true root vegetables. Usually this part of the plant is very, very dense, very hardy. So the cooking methods, if you do cook these plants, generally are longer, slower cooking methods. When you're starting to cook these, if you're boiling or simmering these plants, these parts of the plant, start them off in cold water. And I'll tell you why. If you put these dense parts of the plant into boiling water, the outside of the plant is going to be overcooked before the heat has penetrated to the middle and cooked the middle part of the vegetable until it's tender. If you start off in cold water, the heat moves through the vegetable much more evenly, cooking the vegetable much more evenly. So anytime, if you take a look at a vegetable, the harder it is, you should start off in cold water. These vegetables are beautiful for slow dry heat methods, such as roasting. They work really well for that application. But they're also good as ingredients and flavor builders in things like stews. They're good for pickling, great for soup. You can see some roasted root vegetables down in the bottom left, a very famous beet soup called borscht in the middle. And then you can see a lovely beef stew with root vegetables, including turnip, on the right-hand side. These parts of the plants are really good sources of nutrients such as carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals. And in the case of beets, beets have this compound in them. It's an incredibly powerful antioxidant called beta-cyanin, and it's really only found in a few things: beets, flower petals, and some fungi, but very powerful antioxidant. It is found in some yellow orange, so if you've got golden beets, etc., they also have that compound in them. Let's go to the true root vegetables. These this part of the plant are in fact the root. Carrots are a good example of a root vegetable. Now here you can see this picture of a variety of different carrots, different colored carrots. And what we're really familiar with is the orange carrot. Well, that's not the natural color of carrots at all. In fact, purple and white carrots are much more natural than the orange ones. The orange ones were kind of hybridized and grown to be orange just to suck up to a guy called William of Orange back in the Netherlands back in the day. And they became very popular as a result, and that was what people expected. But now we can see a variety of different colors of carrots. And so that you can make a decision if you want to put carrots on a plate, what color you want to introduce to the plate. Parsnips, which is another root vegetable. It looks a lot like a carrot. It's a little bit softer. It tastes a lot like parsley. I believe it's in the parsley family, but it's got a lot of the characteristics of the carrot. Radishes are root vegetables, and there's a huge variety of different radishes, colors, shapes, sizes, and flavors from very sharp, spicy to quite sweet. The root vegetables can be purchased fresh, frozen, or canned. Root vegetables tend to be dense and firm, so all the things that I talked about with the swollen bulb portion of the plant hold true for the root vegetables. Usually they're cooked using moist heat, slow moist heat methods, steaming, boiling, or simmering. Again, start root vegetables in cold water when boiling. If you can't remember, first of all, anything that's dense, you want to start in cold water. But think, if it grows under the ground, that's low temperature, that's how you start it off. Some of these vegetables are also suitable for dry heat, such as roasting, sautéing, etc. Many of them are served as raw components in salads or as part of a crudité platter. Root vegetables are a very good source of many nutrients, including carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals. And we've got sprouting beans, sprouting the sprouted seeds of a plant. So some of the seeds are sprouting, and we're going to talk a little bit about the floral parts or the leafy parts. But if you're just talking about sprouted seeds, well, here's some examples, so maybe make it clear. Mung bean sprouts. You can see these are the bean sprouts that you have in a lot of Asian food. Adzuki, these are a type of bean. You can see them starting to sprout. And a variety of different legumes, particularly lentils, other beans, seeds, etc., can be sprouted. These can be used particularly, they can be purchased fresh or canned. You can make them yourself. They're really quite easy to make. You just soak your seeds and just put them in a container and keep them moist, and then a couple of days later they start to sprout themselves. They're very succulent. That means they're very moist on the inside. If you think about the bean sprout, that kind of describes that succulence. If you're cooking them, they require very fast dry heat methods, such as in a stir fry. They can be eaten raw, but I have to really stress, you have to be very careful with these. These sprouts have been linked to numerous outbreaks of foodborne illness, such as Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli. So only get your sprouts from a reputable source. Make sure they're cleaned thoroughly. Ideally, they should be cooked to destroy the pathogens, although, if you're making up a sprout salad or something, or using sprouts as a garnish on food, you may not be able to cook them, but just use caution when you're using these products. Tubers. What's a tuber? Let's talk a little bit about a tuber. It's different from a root vegetable. In fact, a tuber is part of the plant's stem. It's a swollen portion of the stem that's underground. It's usually short and it's usually fleshy. When you see some examples of tubers, you'll understand what I mean by that. The tuber, by definition, should be able to create a new plant. So if you take a slice of potato, as long as it's got an eye in it, you can put it in the ground and it'll grow a new potato plant. Potatoes are an example of tubers. Sweet potato, an example. Yam, taro, and a indigenous North American plant, Jerusalem artichoke or sunchoke. These are all examples of tubers. Let's talk about potatoes. There's a couple of pictures. See if you can see the differences between these two potatoes. One of them looks a little bit rougher, one's a little bit smoother, shinier. Just by looking at the potato gives you an indication of the characteristics and what type of food you can make best with these different types of potatoes. The one on the left is what we call a mealy or starchy potato, and the one on the right is called a waxy potato. And when you go to select a potato to make a particular dish, pay attention to whether or not the potato is mealy or starchy, because they turn out quite differently when you prepare them. For mealy potatoes, you're looking for a thick skin, a rough skin. Often you'll see residue of soil and so on still on the potato. The mealy or starchy potato has a higher starch content. These are older potatoes. They have a lower water content. And what we can do with these potatoes that have these characteristics, well, if you take a look at this potato, you should recognize it. The mealy potatoes cook to a light, fluffy texture, making them perfect for things like a baked potato. That's when you order baking potatoes, or at the grocery store you see baking potatoes, they will be mealy potatoes. So they're excellent for that. Think about a good baked potato. When it's baked properly, you should be able to just cut a little cross in the top and then squeeze the corners together and it pops out. Looks almost like popcorn. It's all light and fluffy on the inside. As well, if you're making mashed potatoes or pureed potatoes, if you're making up a pomme duchesse, which you will be in class, I'm sure, and then making different variations from the pomme duchesse, best to use a mealy potato to start, because your pureed potato is going to have a nice light fluffy consistency, not a kind of a stodgy rubbery consistency. As well, French fries. I mean, why you wouldn't use a mealy potato for French fries, I don't know. Think about a really good French fry. Nice and crisp on the outside, but the inside it should be nice and fluffy and light. And you get that from the higher starch potato, the mealy potato. Now, the waxy potato has some really great characteristics as well, but not for the things that the mealy potato can do. To identify the waxy potato, you're looking for a thin, smooth, or papery skin, shiny. The waxy potato has a lower starch content and a higher sugar content, so those long strands of polysaccharides are a little bit shorter in the waxy potato, which means that the density or the firmness of the potato is going to be different. Also, the waxy potatoes have a higher water content. So what we can use these types of potatoes for, these potatoes are going to have a nice firm texture. They're going to hold their shape really well. So anything where you want the potato to retain that nice shape, have a nice texture, not just fall apart, a waxy potato is your choice. The waxy potatoes, sorry, that's a mistake. The waxy potatoes should cook to a denser, more firm texture, making them perfect for soups and stews. If you're putting potatoes in your stew, if you're putting potatoes as a garnish in soup, then the waxy potato is the best choice. If you want to use the soup to thicken, or the potato to thicken your soup, then a mealy potato is a better choice, because it will sort of fall apart but thicken up your soup. So think about what you're using the potato for. Waxy potatoes are excellent for roasting. They're excellent for boiling. There is something called an all-purpose potato, or a chef's potato. This falls somewhere in between the starchy and waxy potatoes. So this would be a very useful potato. It makes pretty good mash, pretty good fries, but it also holds its shape pretty well for boiling and roasting, etc. And it sort of falls somewhere in between. It's useful for many culinary applications. When you're purchasing the potatoes, you can buy them fresh and whole, fresh and processed. That is, they could already be turned into Parisienne or Chateau potatoes. You can buy canned potatoes, dried potatoes, potato flakes, etc., instant mashed potatoes, frozen processed potatoes such as French fries, hash browns, home fries, and tater tots, and so on. So potatoes you can buy in a variety of different formats. Fresh potatoes should be stored outside of the refrigerator, ideally in temperatures between 6 and 10 degrees Celsius, so a nice cool place. You want a nice dark place and a dry place. We don't want the potatoes to start growing, and we want to try and prevent the potatoes from getting exposed to sunlight. If we store potatoes in the fridge, those long strands of polysaccharides, the long strands of sugars, will shorten. So if I have baking potatoes or potatoes that I want to use for puree or for baking or for French fries, If I put those potatoes in the fridge, they're going to take on the characteristics of a waxy potato. That is, it's not going to be, the flesh isn't going to be light and fluffy. It's going to become more dense and firm and waxy because those polysaccharides are shortening. If you have put potatoes in the fridge, you can take them out, and in a day or two those strands will lengthen again, and then you'll get back to those original desirable traits of the starchy potato. Another challenge with putting potatoes in the fridge is once the potatoes have been refrigerated, if you cook them up to a high temperature, such as deep frying is particularly bad, potatoes that have been stored in the fridge will form a carcinogenic compound. A carcinogenic compound means a cancer-causing compound, acrylamide. And this is obviously not something that we want to have in our potatoes. So store your potatoes outside of the fridge. Make sure you keep them nice and dark. If you allow your potatoes to get exposed to sunlight, the potatoes will start to develop chlorophyll, and you know chlorophyll is a green pigment as well as a mild toxin called solanine. This will make the potatoes taste bitter and could potentially make you ill. The solanine is a toxin, and if you eat too much of it, you can get sick. You can see there on the top right, you see some potatoes that are turning green. This means the potatoes have been exposed to sunlight. So that's not what we want to do. Now there's a huge amount of different potatoes that are available to us now, different colors, from the purple Peruvian potatoes to Yukon Golds and very yellow potatoes, redskin potatoes, we've got very white potatoes, different shapes, the fingerling potatoes. There's so many different types of potatoes that all have different characteristics. So when you're starting to design menus and think about plates, think of some of the options and alternatives to potatoes. Don't just go with just a mashed potato, or I hate to say it, but not even just a French fry. But use a variety, or think of using a variety of potatoes for adding color and texture to the plate. As I mentioned earlier, we talked about the sprouts, but the sprouting seeds, or the seed leaves, this is very often used in kitchens. These are what we call microgreens. And the microgreens are just young plants from a variety of different plants that have some of the characteristics of the adult plants, but they can be used to enhance a dish, for garnish, for flavor, etc. You look at the variety of the different microgreens, the different colors. You've got things like arugula, which is going to give you a nice a peppery taste to your food. Cinnamon basil, which gives you a bit of cinnamon to it. Lemon gives you that citrusy taste to it. Beets, very sweet. Chervil gives you a nice licoricey, little micro mint. So you can see this huge variety of microgreens that you can buy and use on food now. They really can enhance a plate visually. Take a look at this. This looks like a gravlax, a salmon. That's a cured salmon with some nice diced beets, but these microgreens as a garnish on top. Microgreens are often purchased fresh. In fact, some cases they're purchased live. You'll get flats with the live plants growing in them still. The microgreens are served raw. Make sure that you use a reliable source for the microgreens, as they are at high risk of carrying pathogens such as Salmonella, Clostridium botulinum, Listeria, and E. coli. These are all nasty organisms that can make people sick. So don't take any chances. Always use a reputable supplier for your microgreens. The microgreens are used as garnishes on many dishes. They can add color, shape, flavor, etc. As you can see on the left, it really does make that plate stand out. Just be careful. Some of the microgreens are made from the brassica plants. Mustard is one of what's called the priority allergens in Canada. These are the top 10 foods that people are allergic to, and surprisingly mustard is one of them. The seedling of any plant that's related to mustard, so any of the brassicas, shouldn't be served to anybody who has a mustard allergy. The proteins are in the seeds, and the same proteins are found in the seeds of, say, broccoli or arugula microgreens. So be very careful. Make sure that if anyone has any food allergies that you're aware of it, and don't use any of the Brassica family seedlings or microgreens on your plates. Now, just so you know, once the plant is matured, the protein that causes the allergic reaction, it's in the seed. It doesn't stay in the adult plant. So somebody who has a mustard allergy can safely consume broccoli and Brussels sprouts and things like that. Bulbs. Let's take a look at bulbs. Onion is a good example of a bulb. Leek, scallion, shallot, garlic, and fennel. I threw that in there. It's not related to the other plants, but it is definitely an example of a bulb. Onions. Let's talk about onions. Onions, leeks, scallions, chives, garlic are all members of the lily family. They all contain this sulfur compound that I talked about earlier with the crucifers, and these sulfur compounds have very powerful antioxidant qualities. It also is what gives onions and garlic that very pungent aroma. Red onions also contain anthocyanin, which is a powerful antioxidant. You can see the color on it. That's that red-purple pigment, anthocyanin. There's a huge variety of onions, various shapes and sizes. There's just a few examples of different shapes and sizes of onions that you can get. Some onions have a very sharp flavor. They're best suited for cooking, such as the yellow onion or cooking onion. And others are sweeter and they're best eaten raw. So, for example, the white onion, the Vidalia onion, the red onion. If you want to serve a raw onion on a dish, they're a little bit sweeter, not quite as sharp. They certainly, especially some of the sweeter onions, they're good for cooking because they caramelize and get some nice color, rich color. If you're making, say, a French onion soup, for example, you can get some nice caramelized onion, making your soup rich and tasty. But they're also very suitable if you're putting them raw on hamburger, hot dog, etc., or as a component within other raw dishes, salads, and so on. Because of the high sugar content of onions, they're really good for adding color to stocks and sauces as part of what's called a mirepoix, or as an onion brulee. The word brulee is French for burnt. You may have heard of a creme brulee. It's burnt cream, and it's literally what you do to the onion. And you can see in a mirepoix, this is a standard mirepoix. It's 2 parts onion to 1 part each carrot and celery. This is used as a flavor builder in the making of stocks and a variety of other applications. But when you think about a brown stock, you want to really enrich the color of it, and you can do that by caramelizing the sugars in the onions and in the carrots, and that's going to give you a nice rich color and flavored stock. And here's a picture of the onion brulee. You can see it's exactly what it's described as, a burnt onion. So you would burn the onion in the pan, and then you would float the burnt onion, the onion brulee, in your stock or your jus, and that's going to take that dark, rich color out and introduce it to your sauce to make it much darker, richer, and so on. I think we need to talk a little bit about pH. The pH scale, for those of you who don't know, is a scale that goes from 1 to 14, and it describes the relative acidity or alkalinity or base of a product or of something. 1 is pure acid, 14 is pure alkaline. pH balanced, you may have heard that term used in commercials for shampoo and so on. That's 7, that's pH neutral. Humans, they're running usually around 7.2, so slightly alkaline. Water, distilled water, is a 7. Most of the good foods that we eat, if you take a look at the chart, are falling anywhere in the range from around 4 up to around 7 or 8. And that's from food safety. You're going to be taking a course in that. That's a very critical thing to remember, is we want to try and ensure that foods that are pH neutral or slightly acidic, that we manage them very carefully to ensure we don't allow pathogens to grow. But the reason we're talking about pH scale in this class is because that's got a lot to do with retaining color and nutrients in the vegetables. So remember that 1 is very acidic, 14 is basic, 7 is neutral. Let's talk about pigments. Pigments are chemicals that give plants their colors. As we've talked a lot about colors, there's a variety of different colors in plants. These are produced by chemicals that are in the plants. Any green color in a plant is from a pigment called chlorophyll. You may remember that from elementary school, talking about photosynthesis and how plants work. From a culinary perspective, we need to know about chlorophyll. A lot of the plants that we eat, the vegetables that we eat, are green. And so we better have a little bit of understanding of what happens to chlorophyll and some of its characteristics. Chlorophyll is very sensitive to low pH or acidic environments. So remember on that pH scale, if we're cooking broccoli in water, for example, that's fine. But if we start adding any vinegar, lemon juice, wine to this cooking water, we are going to destroy the chlorophyll or break down the chlorophyll, making our vegetables discolored. If we have a vibrant green vegetable like a broccoli or green bean or spinach, something like that, it'll turn a khaki to a brown color if we add acidity. Here's a good example of this. This is some spinach cooked in an acidic solution. You can see on the left it's not very appealing. It's kind of a khaki brownish color, whereas the spinach on the right was cooked in a more alkaline solution. Could have been neutral to slightly alkaline solution. So you can see the definite impact of using an acidic environment. You want to avoid that with green vegetables. Also, chlorophyll is sensitive to heat. If we overheat or overcook green vegetables, they'll turn brown. If you take a look here at a scale from raw to perfectly cooked to overcooked, and that overcooked will just get more and more brownish as the vegetable is cooked too much. So chlorophyll isn't a very stable pigment. Most green vegetables, almost all green vegetables, you need to cook over high heat, cook them very quickly, don't expose them to heat for a long period of time, and certainly don't include any acidity in the cooking medium. If you want to include some acidity, if you want to have, say, broccoli with lemon juice, etc., or beans with some lemon juice, do that just before serving, or serve the lemon on the side and allow the guest to put it on an a la minute at the last minute, and that'll help to retain the beautiful green color. Yellow-orange pigments. Yellow-orange vegetables are colored by compounds called carotenoids. Now think about yellow-orange things. Think about carrots, squash, pumpkin, etc. I know all of us have probably done it. We've probably all overcooked those vegetables. But when we do, even though they may be mushy, etc., they stay the same color. They don't change color. So we know that carotenoids are very heat stable. We also know that carotenoids are very pH stable. Regardless of the pH, the color of the carotenoid, the vegetables that are carotenoids, the yellow, orange, and a couple of examples of red, they stay that color. So we can reduce the pH, add some vinegar, add some wine. A good example, tomato sauce. So tomatoes are colored, even though they're yellow, they're colored by carotenoids. When we add some vinegar or some wine, if we're making a tomato sauce, it doesn't start to get drab, doesn't sort of fade the color. The color stays just as vibrant. The beta carotene is part of this carotenoid, and when we consume vegetables that have this pigment in them, we convert the beta carotene into vitamin A in our body, into retinol. So that's a good thing. We find the carotenoids in yellow-orange vegetables like carrots, squash, pumpkins. As well, we find them in some red vegetables such as tomatoes and red peppers. White vegetables are pigmented with something called a flavone. Flavones are sensitive to alkaline. They don't like alkaline conditions. If you cook something that's white, like cauliflower, parsnip, etc., in an alkaline solution, it'll turn gray. You say, well, how would you make something alkaline? Well, you could add baking soda to your solution. That would make it alkaline, which you don't want to do here. But also dish soap, the residual dish soap left over, if you haven't rinsed off your utensils, your cookware properly, this will raise the pH and perhaps discolor any white colored vegetables. So make sure any cookware that's been washed with soap gets rinsed thoroughly. But flavones like acidity. They like a lower pH. So if you add a little bit of acid to your cooking medium, to your boiling water, for example, a little lemon juice, a little vinegar, some wine, that'll help to really brighten up the colors, keep them nice and white, which is what our customers want. Examples I've given you: cauliflower, parsnip, navet, which is the white turnip, salsify, which is a taproot. It's very dark on the outside, very dark bark on the outside. When you peel it, it turns very white. These are all examples that are pigmented with flavones. Red purple. We mentioned this pigment a number of times already. Anthocyanins, very, very strong antioxidant. You find these anthocyanins in a variety of places, fruit and vegetables, and they're very good at destroying free radicals, helping cells to recover, to remain healthy, and so on. So anthocyanin is a very powerful antioxidant. And like flavones, anthocyanins, actually they are a flavonoid, but they are sensitive to alkaline conditions. And in fact, you can see some pretty dramatic results. If you cook or soak a vegetable that's colored with the anthocyanin in an alkaline solution, it'll turn this really kind of pretty shade of blue. But that's not what we want. We want these vegetables to stay nice and purple. Here's a scale we can take a look at. So if you take a look at different pHs, at 6, the red cabbage, for example, will stay the beautiful color that we want. As we increase the acidity, you can see that it starts to wash out the color a little bit. So you want to slightly acidulate your liquid, but you don't want to overdo it. If there's some residue of dish detergent, or for whatever reason somebody's raised the pH in the liquid, you can see that it turns this dark blue and eventually kind of a greeny yellow color. And this is all an effect of the pH. If you take a look, here's some real pictures. So pH neutral, you retain that kind of purple color. As you increase the alkalinity, increase the pH, you can see starts to turn green and eventually kind of a yellow color, which if I'm serving braised red cabbage, I don't want it to look like that. I want it to be purple. And as I increase the acidity up to the maximum, you can see that it turns bright red. As I said, this anthocyanin is a powerful antioxidant. We can find these anthocyanins. They're found in red and purple vegetables and fruits such as red cabbage, red onion, blueberries. Red wine is a good source of anthocyanins. So very, very good for you. Any red purple vegetables would be very good for you. Some other purple-red vegetables are pigmented by something called beta-cyanin or betanin. Again, like the anthocyanins, the betanin is very sensitive to pH, stays very vibrant in low pH preparations. If you're doing, say, a pickled beet, for example, very low pH, quite a lot of vinegar in there, but you can see that the purple is going to just stay rich and deep purple. If you raise the alkalinity, you're going to get some discoloration. This betanin or beta-cyanin is also a powerful antioxidant, very good for you. And we can find this in beets, we can find it in some flower petals, and some fungi. All right, I've covered a little bit about storage of vegetables. Let's just talk about how we're going to buy these things, store, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the general nutritional stuff with regards to vegetables. Most culinary vegetables are purchased fresh. Just think about when you're buying fresh, you're going to have generally a lower food cost, but a higher labor cost. You need more storage, etc. So you have to think about all these factors when you're making a decision. When you buy the vegetables fresh, though, it gives you more options. You can do more things with them because they aren't already either pre-cooked or pre-cut, etc. So it gives you more options for it. Some vegetables are available frozen, canned, dried, or processed. When you talk about the nutrition of these vegetables, surprisingly, fresh vegetables or fruit aren't necessarily the best quality from a nutritional standpoint. When you think about certain vegetables, they might have been picked weeks or months in advance and then stored before shipping long distances. Many of these vegetables might be picked before they're fully ripened and they haven't developed their potential nutritional value or flavor. Good example would be tomatoes. Often tomatoes are picked when they're green and then they're gassed using this ethylene gas, which is not dangerous, but what it does is it causes foods to ripen, and different foods will actually off-gas as ethylene, so you shouldn't store them together. Apples, for example, well, off-gas ethylene. So if you store apples together with other vegetables or fruit, those other vegetables or fruit will become overripe quite quickly because of the gas coming off these apples. But what happens is you've got these green tomatoes that haven't produced all the sugars and acids and all the nutrients and so on, all the flavor compounds that a fully ripened vegetable or fruit would get. They're picked while they're green because they can be shipped without damaging them. They don't bruise so easily. They're all a consistent shape, a consistent size, etc. And they're shipped, they're gassed with the ethylene so they turn bright red. So they look okay, you know, they're nice and even, but they don't taste good at all. They have no taste. The texture is not good compared to going out to the garden and picking a ripe tomato right off the vine and eating it. There's no comparison whatsoever. So in that case, fresh vegetables aren't necessarily always your best choice. And when you think the other side, frozen fruit and vegetables, they're often picked and frozen right when they're at their peak of ripeness. They don't have to take them off the vines or off the plants early because they're going to process them pretty well on site. And so these frozen fruit and frozen vegetables are picked when they're at their peak of ripeness, when they've got all the sugars and nutrients, etc. And then they're frozen right away, locking all that stuff in. So sometimes, and quite often, frozen fruit, frozen vegetables might make them a more nutritious choice than even fresh. A downside is, though, that the freezing process disrupts the cells of the plant, so it's really hard, in fact I would say impossible, to cook a frozen vegetable to al dente because they're already going to be quite soft by the time you use them. I mean, some examples of frozen fruit or frozen vegetables that don't lose quality, you know, corn, for example. Frozen corn niblets is as good as getting it off the cob generally. So it makes it hard to cook these to al dente. So when you're making your decisions between fresh and frozen, remember, fresh, you're going to have a higher labor cost, processing costs. You need storage facilities for them. Frozen, they're much more convenient. You get 100% yield. That is, there's no trim, there's no waste. It's all used. And your labor cost is going to be much lower. But you don't have as many options with the product. Canned fruit and vegetables often contain preservatives that can affect the flavors. Many canned vegetables contain large quantities of sodium, so from a nutritional standpoint, they may not be very good for you. Some fruit, for example, contain additional sugars. I see that the market is changing a little bit now. You're able to buy very low sugar canned fruit, but you have to read the labels. As well, the texture of canned vegetables is often soft or mushy. There's no comparison between, say, for example, fresh asparagus versus a canned asparagus. They're night and day. They're completely different animals. Some canned fruit and vegetables make it very convenient in a professional kitchen, though. There are certain types or certain fruit or vegetables that you get canned that you just wouldn't be able to, generally speaking, keep up with if you didn't have the canned goods. You know, artichoke hearts is a good example. If you ever use artichoke hearts as a garnish on hors d'oeuvre, etc., you got one artichoke heart from every artichoke. It's a real nuisance, time-consuming, space. It takes a lot of space to get these artichokes hearts off the artichokes. So therefore, something like buying the canned artichoke hearts is much more economical from both a food and labor cost for chefs. A more common example would be canned tomato products. Use canned tomatoes in a variety of different applications, and there's some really high quality, good quality canned tomato products in a variety of different formats: whole tomatoes, diced tomatoes, pureed tomatoes, etc. And these will help to reduce your labor cost. Now, just again, read the labels. Some are better than others. Some have additional ingredients. Some have higher sodium, etc. So be careful when you're selecting these. But there's maybe a very good reason why you would want to go with canned vegetables or canned fruit. If you're buying canned cherries and things like that, just you have to look at what your environment is, what your kitchen can manage. Dried fruit and vegetables are good in that they don't need any refrigeration. Because they're dehydrated, they might retain their nutrient value, and when you reconstitute them, you might get that nutrient value back. Remember that they need to be reconstituted to replace the lost water. And as a result, once you reconstitute them, you're not going to get the same texture. If you're using, say, dried beans or dried mushrooms or any other dried product, when you reconstitute them, you're not going to get the same consistency, the same texture as you will when you use fresh. But one of the advantages is the dried vegetables might have a more intense flavor just because of the evaporation and the concentration of those flavor compounds. So, for example, if I'm using dried mushrooms, I'll often save the dust from the bottom of the container of the mushrooms and use that to enhance flavors. It's one of those glutamate vegetables, so it really enhances the flavor of things like stocks and sauces and so on. So there are some upsides to the dried vegetables, so don't discount them. The storage of vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables, most produce, fresh fruit and vegetables, is stored in the refrigerator between 0 and 4 degrees. That's outside the temperature danger zone. 0, as you should know, is freezing, and then at the bottom end of the temperature danger zone is 4. So we want to try and keep our fridges running within that range. Unfortunately, this is a little too cold for most produce, most fruits and vegetables and herbs, etc. One of the advantages to the cooler temperature, though, is it will help to slow down deterioration. The shelf life is going to be longer on the fruit and vegetables, but from a quality standpoint, it tends to suppress flavors and so on by refrigerating them too much. In the fridge, there's different temperature zones. Even though the fridge should be functioning between 0 and 4 degrees, when you put produce in the fridge, when you put herbs in the fridge, you want to try and store them in the warmest part of the fridge, which is still cool, but not as cold as some areas of the fridge. Things that are very delicate, like fresh herbs and so on, they have to be stored so that the cold air from the fan doesn't blow onto them. That'll just ruin basil, for example, just turn black and get wilted very quickly if it gets too cold. If you take a look, here is sort of a schematic of the inside of a fridge, of a walk-in fridge. Here we can see the door, and then usually just inside the door, usually around waist level, is the thermostat. This senses the temperature in the fridge. Now right by the door is very warm, or relatively warm, so the thermostat is almost always going to be showing temperatures higher than what you'll see in other areas of the fridge, and as a result, it'll activate the fan, which will blow cold air into the fridge. Just above the door, you've got warm air as the door is opening and closing. So up in the front corner, that's where you've got warmer air rising up in there. And then at the back of the fridge, you've got cold air being blasted down, that's below freezing often, being blasted down from the fan. So generally speaking, in a walk-in, what you're going to find is this back bottom corner is the coldest area of the fridge. So down here, down at the bottom, this is where your potentially hazardous foods, your seafood, your meats, your poultry, etc. This is a really good place to store them. This is where the cold air settles. It's away from the door, and that's generally where you're going to get the coldest part. So that's not really the best part to store your produce. The best part for your produce, if you need to store the produce in the fridge, up in the top just above by the door, that's where it's kind of the warmest area. Just keep it away from the fan so that's not blowing the cold air onto the product. Make sure that the product can't be contaminated by raw meats, poultry, or seafood. In your sanitation course, you will learn about the proper practice of storing food in a refrigerator, but use common sense. If you've got raw meat, the potential is that it might drip down onto whatever's below it. So make sure that whatever's below it is something that it won't matter. In fact, you should put your raw meat right at the bottom shelf. You don't want to definitely put your salad ingredients or food that's never going to be cooked below any raw meat, run the risk of any kind of contamination. So make sure that your produce is stored in such a way that you don't allow it to get contaminated by these other potentially hazardous foods. Ideally, some produce such as onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes should be stored outside of the refrigerator. If you have a cool, dark, dry space, those products lend themselves very well to that kind of storage. If you have a dry storage area that's got temperature control and you can keep it cooler, make sure there's no windows, make sure there's no overhead piping that's going to allow moisture to condense and drip down into the food. That would be a good place for these items. Canned vegetables, dried vegetables and fruit. Again, these get stored in a dry storage area. And you want to try and prevent exposure to moisture, exposure to sunlight. If you've got fruit, particularly in jars, and you allow sunlight to hit it, then the product might start fermenting as it warms up inside the jars. So this isn't something that we want to have happen. We want to try and keep these things, avoid moisture. If we've got dried beans and peas, as long as we don't add moisture to them, they can be left out at room temperature. As soon as moisture is added to them, they become very hazardous. They're just like raw meat. So and you lose quality and you lose the food. So your food cost would go up. So these things need to be in a cool, dry place with no exposure to sunlight. Frozen fruit and vegetables, they need to be stored in the freezer. And the freezer temperatures should be below -18, which is 0 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, next week. I think that's enough for this week. Next week, I'm going to continue talking about ingredients. We're going to be taking a look next week at fungi, meats, dairy. Next week, remember, there is a test 1, that'll be conducted on Blackboard. I'll give you more details before you're going to be writing that. Don't forget about the drop-in on Tuesdays from 5 till 6. This is a real-time drop-in using Microsoft Teams. The link is on Blackboard under drop-ins. So next Tuesday, 5 to 6. Drop-in last week was a really good time. We had a fun discussion last week. We were talking about ramen. We were talking about whiskey. We were talking about rabbits. We were talking about squirrels. So don't forget to drop in for that. Also, please participate and get on the discussion board. There hasn't been much movement on there yet, but I would like it if we could get some discussions going on the board. And that's all I got. Have a great week and take care. We will talk to you next week. Cheers.